The night the jackets were swapped started with the sound of helicopters chopping the desert air and red-blue light washing over the highway like blood and water, and Marcus Grave Calder knew before the call came that something had crossed a line, because trouble always announced itself with noise and fear before it showed its face. And when the clubhouse phone rang, he was already standing, scars pulling tight across his ribs, as if his body remembered other nights like this, other times when promises had turned heavy as chains. The voice on the line belonged to a trucker who owed the club a favor, breathless, saying there was a state manhunt rolling through the county. Roadblocks up, dogs out, and a teenage girl running scared through the scrub near the old rail spur. And Grave felt his jaw lock because his daughter Lily was supposed to be home hours ago, wearing one of his old cuts because she liked how it smelled like oil and smoke and safety. And when he stepped outside the clubhouse, the engines were already idling like animals sensing a storm. The moon thin and sharp above empty asphalt. Memories flickering in his head of another jacket once soaked in blood, of a promise he made to never let family pay for his sins. And he rode hard through the night, wind tearing at him, seeing the road like a ribbon of choices he could never undo. The trigger came fast and ugly when he found the crash site by the rail spur. A burned-out sedan nosed into a ditch, sirens closing in, and two girls crouched behind a rusted signal box, one his daughter and one a stranger with bruises blooming on her throat and eyes too old for her face. And as Grave slid to a stop, the stranger grabbed Lily's shoulders and whispered something frantic, hands shaking as she yanked the Hell's Angels cut off Lily's back and shoved her own threadbare hoodie on instead, the leather heavy and unmistakable, patches catching the moonlight like a target. And Lily froze for a heartbeat, then let it happen, because fear makes you obey the wrong orders sometimes. And Graves saw the truth hit him all at once, that the runaway knew the jacket would draw the dogs, draw the cops, draw death away from a biker's daughter. And when the helicopters dipped low, the stranger bolted wearing Graves' colors while Lily stumbled the other way. And Grave felt something tear loose inside him as he shoved Lily toward the drainage culvert and told her to stay silent no matter what, because choices made in seconds echo for years. And when he turned back, the girl in the jacket was already gone, sirens chasing her like wolves. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Grave didn't remember the ride back to the clubhouse, only the weight of Lily's tears soaking his shirt and the way his hand shook when he lit a cigarette he never finished. And inside the hall, the smell of oil and old wood wrapped around him like a confession booth, the faces of his brothers watching without questions, because they knew that look, the look of a man whose world had tilted. And Graves sat alone for a long minute, hearing the echo of the runaway's footsteps in his skull and wondering what kind of life teaches a kid to sacrifice herself for someone she doesn't know. Flashbacks cutting and sharp and unwanted of his own youth running from a father's fists, of a cut earned and lost, of a cop named Rourke who taught him early that badges could be bought, and mercy was a rumor. And now Rourke was the sheriff leading the manhunt, barking orders on a radio Grave could hear through open windows, hungry to pin something on the club after years of failed tries. Lily sat on a crate, knees to chest, whispering that the girl said her name was May, that she was 16, that she was running from a house where the doors locked from the outside, and Grave felt the old moral ledger open inside him. Columns of debt and blood and loyalty, and he knew that. Jacket out there on May's back was a death sentence, because Rourke would never bring her in alive wearing those colors. And Grave stood, pain flaring through his spine like a warning, and told Lily to look at him, to hear him, that she was safe and loved, and that some nights love meant doing hard things for strangers. And when he kissed her forehead, he tasted salt and gasoline and regret. Outside, engines revved as the night deepened, and Grave watched the highway stretch away empty and dark, imagining May stumbling through brush, leather too big on her shoulders, dogs closing, helicopters sweeping, and he made the choice then, quiet and final, that the club would find her before the law did. Not because it was smart or clean, but because a promise had been made without words when a scared kid took a jacket meant to protect family. And Grave had learned long ago that colors were only cloth unless men bled for what they stood for. And as he stepped into the night, he felt the weight of leadership settle like a crown of thorns, knowing this manhunt would wake old enemies, that Rourke would use it to strike, that saving one runaway could cost him everything. But some debts were older than fear, and some lines, once crossed, demanded you ride straight into the dark and let the consequences find you. The clubhouse came alive like a wounded animal stirring when Grave called the brothers in. Boots scraping, chairs dragging, engines outside cooling with ticking sounds that matched the tension in the room, and the long table filled with men who had ridden together through funerals and fires, each face carrying a story that didn't need telling. Brick the enforcer with shoulders like a wall and eyes that never blinked first, Elias Wire. The strategist already sketching routes on a grease-stained map with a pencil nub. Doc Moreno, the medic, setting a first aid kit on the table out of habit because trouble always bled. Skinny Pete on lookout duty, pacing near the windows, counting helicopters by sound. And June, the quiet rider who handled money and favors, leaning back with arms crossed, listening more than speaking. And Graves stood at the head, hands flat, voice low and steady as he told them about May, about the jacket, about Lily's tears, leaving nothing out because lies rot brotherhood from the inside. And when he finished, there was a silence thick enough to choke on until Brick cracked it by saying the kid wore our colors to save blood, and that makes her family whether she knows it or not. And Wire nodded without looking up, pointing out Rourke's roadblocks, the K9 patterns, the thermal sweeps, how the sheriff liked to herd prey toward the quarry where cameras waited. And Doc cleared his throat, saying 16 was too young to be hunted like this, and he'd seen those bruises before, the kind left by hands that didn't care if a body lived or broke. And Gray felt the club align around him the way it always did when the moral math turned ugly. No votes needed, just shared history. And he told them the plan had to be clean and fast because Rourke would use the jacket as an excuse to bury May in charges she'd never outrun, and Wire laid it out in simple strokes. Two teams leapfrogging through service roads. Brick and June shadowing the dog's likely path with scent. Breakers, Doc staging at the old pump house. Pete riding high ground counting lights. Grave running point, because leadership meant taking the first hit, and the banter came easy even then. Brick asking if Grave still remembered how to run, and Grave deadpanning that scars remember for you. Laughter cutting the fear, just enough to breathe. They moved like a practice thing, engines swallowing the night, headlights off where needed, the highway empty and vast. And Grave rode with Lily's face in, his mind and May's unknown footsteps beating time, thinking about Rourke's smile the last time they crossed paths, the way power tasted to men who never earned it. And as the miles fell away, the radios crackled with updates. Pete counting 3 birds circling low, Wire rerouting them through a wash where the earth drank sound. And they found signs, scuffed boots, a torn thread of leather snagged on mesquite. And Grave felt a cold respect for the kid, who kept moving despite fear, who knew enough to trade jackets like lives were currency. The threat escalated when a rival crew rolled into the area chasing their own angle, vultures smelling chaos. A handful of cutthroats led by a man called Sable who'd always wanted a piece of Graves' territory. And Brick bristled, asking permission with his eyes, but Graves shook his head because blood in the open would only help Rourke, and June worked the phones instead, calling in an old favor to redirect Sable with a rumor of richer prey. Downriver, quiet power doing what Fisk could not, and they pressed on, finding May at Dawn's edge near the culvert line, collapsed and shaking, leather jacket swallowing her small frame, eyes wild when the bikes rolled in until Grave cut his engine and took off his helmet slow so she could see the lines of age and care on his face, hear him say her name like it mattered, and she tried to run anyway because trust had burned her before, and Brick blocked gently, huge hands open, and Doc knelt, checking her ankle, whispering calm, and May broke then, sobbing about the house, about the man who said he was family, about the night she ran with nothing but fear in a hoodie, and Grave listened jaw tight, thinking of promises and costs, while Wire hissed that the dogs were close and Rourke was pushing units toward them faster than expected, the net tightening, and Grave made the hard call to split, sending May with Doc and June in an unmarked truck they'd staged, the jacket coming off her. Shoulders and folded like a flag with too much meaning. Brick staying to draw heat with Grave, Pete riding decoy routes, and the engines roared, dust blooming, helicopters banking, and Rourke's voice crackled on an open channel smug and certain, naming Grave like a trophy he'd waited years to mount, and Grave felt the old anger rise but kept his head, riding clean, letting Brick's presence be a promise of consequences without words. By the time they shook the tail, the sun was up and the county was buzzing, news vans sniffing, rumors flying about a biker kidnapping, about a dangerous girl in stolen colors. And back at the clubhouse, May sat wrapped in a blanket, staring at the floor like it might open, Lily hovering close, and Grave watched them from the doorway, knowing the real fight was just starting, because Rourke would not forgive this slight. Sable would test boundaries again. And protecting one runaway had painted a target on everyone he loved. And as Wire spread the morning, paper with Rourke's face grinning from a quote about restoring order, Grave felt the weight of unavoidable conflict settle in his chest, a storm gathering that no ride could outrun, only meet head-on when the time came. The collision came not with sirens, but with silence, the kind that settles before a door gets kicked in, and Grave felt it in his bones when the clubhouse went too quiet and the radios stopped chirping, Wire's pencil hovering over the map like it knew the next line would be drawn in blood. And May sat rigid on the couch staring at the folded jacket on the table, as if it might bite her, Lily beside her chewing her thumb raw. And Graves' phone buzzed with a block number that he answered without, greeting because some men like to hear their power ring first. Rourke's voice smooth and smiling, congratulating Grave on his charity work and suggesting they talk somewhere neutral, somewhere with cameras, because the county loved transparency and Grave knew that tone, the one that pretended this was a game while moving pieces you couldn't see. And when he hung up, Wire was already listing the tells that Rourke wouldn't call unless he had leverage, that Sable had been spotted near the south, yards that someone inside the system was feeding routes, and Brick's knuckles cracked once like punctuation. The move came fast after that, a cruiser easing past the clubhouse slow enough to be a message, a news van parking across the street like a vulture, and then the betrayal landed hard when June's phone lit up with a panicked whisper from a contact who said Doc had been stopped on a county road, pulled over clean, and then gone dark. The truck impounded, May nowhere listed, and Grave felt the room tilt as the moral ledger slammed shut. because Doc was careful and this smelled like a setup. And when Brick said Rourke took May, Graves' chest burned with a familiar heat that wanted to solve everything with speed and violence. But leadership meant breathing through the pain and choosing the least terrible option. They split again, Wire tracing Rourke's habits, noting the abandoned precinct annex he liked for off-book interrogations. Brick loading up with grim focus, Pete counting, birds overhead and swearing there were none, which meant something worse. And Lily caught Graves' sleeve, eyes wet but steady, saying May saved me, and Grave nodded because some truths didn't need explaining. The annex sat low and ugly against the river, concrete stained with old floods, and inside May sat under a flickering light with cuffs too tight, Rourke circling like a man inspecting a car he planned to sell for parts, asking why she'd wear dead men's colors, why she'd run, telling her. The club would fold when pressed because loyalty was a fairy tale. And May stared back with a courage she didn't know she had, thinking of Lily's hands shaking, of the weight of leather like armor. And she said nothing because silence was the only thing left they couldn't steal. And Rourke smiled and leaned in close, voice dropping, saying he could make her disappear and nobody would ask questions. That he already had a story ready about drugs and gangs and a bad end. And that's when the door blew inward with a sound like thunder trapped in concrete. Brick first through with controlled fury, Grave behind him moving like the road taught him. Wire cutting power, lights dying, chaos blooming, and Rourke's confidence shattered into curses as hands grabbed him and pinned him hard. Brick's forearm across his throat just enough to make the point. Doc stumbling from a side room bruised but breathing. And May's cuffs falling away as Grave shrugged off his cut and wrapped it around her shoulders again because some symbols mattered even when they hurt. The confrontation spilled outside, where Sable chose his moment wrong. Engines roaring in with his crew thinking to pick the bones, bullets cracking the night open, and Grave found himself between fires, shouting orders, Brick holding a line, Wire flanking smart, Pete calling angles, Doc dragging May low and safe, and in the noise Grave locked eyes with Rourke, seeing not a monster but a man who had made too many small choices. That added up to this, and Rourke laughed even then, spitting blood, saying the county would bury them, that there were files and witnesses and favors owed, and Grave made the shocking decision that would split opinions for years, ordering Wire to dump the evidence they'd pulled, the tapes and logs that could burn Rourke to ash, because killing him would make him a martyr, and exposing him clean would force a reckoning the county couldn't ignore, even if it meant losing leverage now. And Brick hesitated just long enough to show his loyalty before obeying, because brotherhood was trusting the man at the front even when your fists disagreed. The fight ended not with a bang, but with sirens finally arriving to a scene that told a different story than Rourke planned. Sable retreating wounded and furious, Doc collapsing into a medic's hands, May clinging to Lily with a sob that shook both of them, and Graves standing still as cuffs clicked around Rourke's wrists, the sheriff's badge dulled, and meaningless under fluorescent light, his eyes promising this wasn't over. And Grave felt the cost settle in, knowing Sable would come back harder, knowing the club had made enemies in daylight now, knowing that saving one girl had cracked open a rot that would spread. But as the sun rose pale over the river and May leaned her head against Grave's side, whispering thank you like a prayer, he knew the sacrifice was worth it, even if the road ahead would demand more blood and harder choices than any of them wanted to pay. The reckoning didn't come in a rush the way movies lied about. It crept in slow and heavy like weather you could feel in your joints. And Grave woke before dawn every day after the annex raid with the sense that the bill was coming due. The clubhouse quieter now, patched walls bearing new scars, brothers moving with purpose but less laughter, because justice delivered in daylight always left shadows behind. And the county turned inside out as Wire's evidence surfaced piece by piece, clean. Enough that even Rourke's friends couldn't scrub it away. Hearings announced, cameras flashing, the sheriff's smile replaced by a hard mask as he was marched through a courthouse he once owned, and Grave watched from the back of a crowd with Lily's hand in his, feeling no triumph, only the weight of consequences settling like dust. Sable didn't wait long to test them, hitting a supply run on the South Highway, leaving a message burned into asphalt that said the balance had shifted. And Grave gathered the brothers in the clubhouse under low light, Brick bruised but ready, Doc's arm in a sling but eyes sharp, Pete quieter than usual, June counting resources with a frown, and Wire laying out the math that said they could win, but not without cost. And Grave made another hard choice, telling them they wouldn't chase revenge into a war that would swallow the innocent, that they'd protect their own and draw a line Sable would break himself on, because redemption didn't come from becoming. What hunted you? May hovered at the edge of all this like a question mark, sleeping on the couch at first, then in Lily's room, starting school under a new name June arranged, flinching at Ray's voices but learning the sound of engines meant safety, and Grave watched her learn how to breathe again. Saw her sit with Doc as he stitched up a prospect, saw her laugh once when Brick tried to cook and failed spectacularly, and it cracked something open in him he'd kept sealed since he buried his own. Youth under leather and miles. The final confrontation chose its own place when Sable pushed too far, rolling into the courthouse parking lot during Rourke's hearing with guns and bravado, thinking spectacle would bend the story back his way, and Grave rode and not to fight, but to end it, bikes lining the street like a wall, Brick stepping forward unarmed, June already on the phone with every reporter who'd listen, Wire feeding live angles to phones. And Sable sneered, calling Grave soft, calling May bait. And that's when May stepped out from behind Lily, jacket on her shoulders not as a shield, but as a statement, voice shaking but clear as she said she wasn't running anymore, that men like him didn't get to decide who broke, and the crowd leaned in. Phones up, truth doing its quiet work, and Sable saw the tide turn and made the worst choice of his life, reaching for a gun in front of cameras and children and the law he thought he owned. And Brick moved faster than thought, disarming him clean, pinning him hard, ending it without blood because strength sometimes meant restraint. The aftermath was loud and slow. Sable hauled away screaming. Rourke sentenced months later in a courtroom that felt smaller without his swagger. The club fined and watched, but standing, and Grave sat in the clubhouse one night alone with the folded jacket on the table, thinking about what it had cost and what it had saved, when May came in and asked if she could keep it, not as armor, but as a reminder, and Grave nodded, feeling tears threaten for the first time in years, because promises kept had a way of healing scars you thought were permanent. The ending didn't tie itself neat. Doc still woke from pain, Pete still scanned the sky, Wire still planned for storms, and Grave still rode the highway at night, listening to the engine and the ghosts. But when May graduated a year later with Lily cheering loud and the brothers lined up awkward and proud, Grave understood redemption. Wasn't a single act or a clean slate. It was choosing again and again, to stand when running was easier, to protect when power tempted you to crush. And as the bikes rolled out into another empty night, headlights cutting a path forward, he knew the road would keep asking for hard answers, and he was ready to ride them out. Family intact, debt paid, with room enough ahead for whatever came next. If you like this story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us keep bringing you powerful stories like this. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. and let us know which part of the story hit you the hardest. Your support means more than you know.